What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Jenks Island podcast, the only NFL podcast where year takes from washed-up Division III cornerback and his friends. I'm your host, Grayson Jenkins, joined again by my great friend and co-host, Ty. And today's episode, we're breaking down another position class for this 2026 NFL Draft. This week, we're going to be doing the tight ends. It's a deeper class than I think last year's was, but the top-end talent is not necessarily what it was from last year. So it's an interesting class to break down because I think once you get past those first 3 to 4 guys, everyone's going to have a different board after that. We're going to give you 6 guys and then an honorable mention, and we're going to go through our lists and break them down. Ty and I had a very, very different ranking individually, but we went through and we made a consensus list. So we'll go through and then individually rank, say where we put them on our lists. So starting off, Ty, with a honorable mention here, we had Joe Royer. This is a guy right from Cincinnati who is a wide tight end. He's going to be more balanced in both the slot and in line. He can do a little bit of everything. He's a solid blocker, not the most polished blocker. He still is able to get overpowered at times in the run game and against bigger guys. But he is a bigger guy himself too. He's 6'5", 247 pounds, bigger in that aspect, but above average as a route runner and good at finding open space when he's running routes. Incredible effort after the catch. You see him on different plays where as soon as he gets the ball, he's turning upfield, trying to make guys miss or overpower guys and run through them. Very physical as a route runner when he's going through his break. If there's a linebacker on him, things like that, he's able to break free from them using his body and his hands. Some cons that I put for him, right? This is an honorable mention. I'm not going to dive too deep into him, but I think a lot of his bigger plays are from broken coverage when I'm watching his tape. A lot of plays, he's wide open on some of his longer routes and longer productive plays. And then I think he's still developing as a run blocker. Like I said, he's still developing that side of his game. But once he truly jumps into that, I think he can really be a productive and solid Y tight end for a team in the league. Ty, what are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I definitely think, he's got to refine some of the technique in the run game, but, he's got the size. So,
Definitely.
there is upside there. And he's not the craziest athlete, but like you said, there is some rack ability there. So I think, he has a lot of room to grow, but he's got a lot of good things that he does. I think the settling and soft spots in the zone, he was probably the best in this class at that. Like he found, soft spots in tons of different route combos, right? It wasn't just that kind of, over the center kind of check down type of looks, right? I think it was on a lot of different, curl type of looks, so like out wide, like you mentioned, he could play inline, he could play out wide. So I think he did a really good job of that. But I think, yeah, like you said, there's some room to grow. I think he has the potential to become, a starting tight end in the NFL because he's got that prototypical size and he's a decent athlete, but it's going to take a little bit of, growing with him. He might be a guy that, grows into that role in like a year 3.
And let me ask you, Ty, before we get further into the list, what do you value personally more? If you're an NFL team, what do you think you should value more, a wide tight end or an F tight end? Because the league's sort of differentiating it, and teams are valuing different types of guys more, and depending on their offensive scheme. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you can get both, obviously, right, that becomes a blue chip premier prospect. But I think if you're picking in the, a tight end in the first or second round, you're looking for guys that can make a difference in the passing game, right? Because that is such a rare trait. You look at a guy like a Kenyon Sadiq, we'll talk about later. He's not the greatest run blocker, but he's just an awesome athlete, and it's hard to pass up on, how that transforms your offense. The blocking tight end, it's kind of a dime a dozen, right? You can get any of those guys that was a backup at Michigan or a backup at Wisconsin and, kind of bring them in and they're your run blocking guy and they come in on third down. Obviously, like I mentioned, if you can get both that's perfect, but that's so rare to see a guy that is, awesome at both. So I think that me personally, I lean towards guys that can, bring something in the pass game than a little bit more in the run blocking game.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think you'll see that when we bring up the next couple of guys on our lists here. But real quick, I just want to say, I think when I'm looking at it, the pass game really, really stands out to me because I think a lot of teams are starting to draft more tight ends that are able to just be pass threats more than run blocking because they can find, they'll just put a six lineman out there instead of having a tight end on that line and worry less about, making obvious that it's a run play. They don't really care about that as much anymore in the league. It seems they're just going to run the ball if they want to run the ball. But I do still like the wide tight end definitely provides you with, or the wide tight end provides you with more opportunities to disguise your looks as an offense. And I think that's definitely an advantage. Moving on to our number 5 guy. We actually have 2 at this spot because of our consensus list. We were kind of both of these guys were in opposite spots on our list, so it's very interesting here. But Ty, I'll let you go first here. I'll let you break down Michael Trigg at number 5. What are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I think Trigg, what he brings in the passing game is such a unique thing that I really only saw out of really Kenyon Sadiq. I think he's obviously a big guy, 6'4", 240 pounds, very smooth athlete, smooth route runner. He's probably one of the better route runners in this class. You could see him kind of, extend on the whole route tree. He really accelerates well. He's kind of some of the double moves and he understands spacing, right? There was a play against Arizona State where it's just a simple hitch route, right? And you think, okay,
Mhm.
let me, kind of move in more and settle in between the linebackers. Instead, he spun out and goes over the top and catches a touchdown. So, that's that next level understanding of spacing. Not only, where do I just move east and west, but when can I spin out and kind of make this a big play? So I think he provides that as a just an athlete, but he's also a physical guy, right? I saw a lot in the run game where in the passing game, but run
When
after
he's running.
catch game.
Yeah.
Yeah, where he was, looking to run guys over, and that's a rare trait to see out of a tight end. A guy that wants to be a bully, wants to run over. That's a George Kittle type of trait, right? You don't see that a ton. He's not George Kittle in the run game, as a run blocker. I think
Mhm.
he's there. He does a good job of walling off, but his hands are very sloppy. A ton of times you see him almost wrap his hands around a guy, and it's just that yields to penalties or whatever it may be. Right? It's just not good blocking technique. So I think he needs to refine his technique, but he's there, and I think. He's got the longest tight end, the wingspan of all the tight ends, right? So he's a bit. Not only is he just a big, tall guy, he's a long guy, and I think he just made some incredible contested and one-handed catches. He brings something in the pass game that I think is just rare to see, right? Where it's a fluid route runner, an athletic guy that can be physical, not only in the run after catch game, but at the catch point and make some awesome catches. I do think he's got some room to grow, as a run blocker. And I think sometimes, he can be a little bit lazier. But I saw some plays where I was like, all right, he's being a little lazy on this play, and then he kind of accelerates when he sees the guy kind of break a tackle and he tries to go to the next level to make a block. So, it's you get kind of the best of both worlds, or not the best of both worlds, but you kind of get both worlds with him there. So I just think what he brings as a receiver is right behind Sadiq, and so that's why I'm at number 2.
Yeah, no, I have him at I have at number 7 on my list. I'm a little bit lower on him, but let me hear me out here. I had him very high on my list as far as a pass catcher goes. I do really enjoy his route running. I think he's a solid route runner. He's a little bit older, so he's going to have more experience than some of these other guys, and he's going to be a little bit more precise and things like that. He had more opportunities, but I will say his character concerns are what really dropped him down the board on my rankings because he got suspended within the team at Baylor I think 1 or 2 times. He got suspended a game or two. I know he got suspended against BYU, and I thought there was a second one, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But when you're suspended by your own team for off the field issues, that's a little bit of a red flag. And I think that's going to be something that comes up in this NFL draft process. We'll see how teams value that, things like that. And then another thing, Ty, I love that you mentioned the one hand catches and things like that because he made some absolutely absurd catches. I want to see him, and at the catch point when there is contact, I think his hands can be a little bit iffier when that contact's happening. He's a little bit iffier there. But like a lot of those one hand catches, he's not necessarily the guy isn't necessarily hitting at his hand and things like that. He had the free arm to do it. Still impressive. Absolutely ridiculous catches. I'm not trying to take away from that. But also one thing that really he would have been higher up on my board if it wasn't for the character issues because he is such a great uh, player at making tacklers miss. I think he was second in the college football as a tight end in missed tackles forced. I believe he had 17, which was second
That's a
in
ton.
college football. And it was just an absurd thing to watch on film when you see him juking guys out, things like that. There was a clip from USC that I saw when I was looking him up at USC. There was like this one scrimmage play where he breaks at least 10 tackles on one play. It was absolutely absurd. And then And that's just something that, if you bring that to the NFL, like that's something we saw Harold Fannin bring this past season, right? A lot of people were questioning him because of his route running, things like that. But when he's breaking tackles, it makes him such a productive player. And if Michael Trigg can bring that to the NFL, he's immediately, and teams see that, he's immediately going to be higher on boards than 7. Like, I just think he's lower on my board because of character issues. That's really the big thing.
No, I think that's fair, and I think that'll yield teams to kind of go away from him, and maybe he ends
Mm-hmm.
up in a better situation. Denver's been a
Yeah.
team that has taken shots on guys that have had issues in the past, and you end up in a good organization that kind of tempers some of those things, and it's no longer a concern. But I did forget to add the piece about some of the contact. Just 'cause I think he plays with a little bit too high pad level at times, right? Where he's over the
Mm-hmm.
middle and he gets contacted. If he plays a little bit lower, right, he can absorb those hits a little bit more, but
Yeah.
he's just plays a little too high.
The second guy tied at our 5th spot, and this was my number 2. So Ty and I both had these guys at 2 and 7, but we had them reversed. My number 2 is going to be Eli Stowers, an absolutely athletic freak at the position. 6'4", 239 pounds, 23. He's going to be 23 years old, so a little bit older out of this class. 4'5", 140, and he had a 45.5-inch vertical. Absolutely absurd. He has 32-inch arms, almost 33 inches. So a decent sized wingspan. He has reliable hands, does a good job of getting his hands out in front of his body and catching the ball instead of letting the ball into his hands. Does a good job of finding soft spots in zones, similar to who we were talking about. Then
Royer.
similar to Royer. Yes, similar to Royer. He does a good job of finding soft spots in the zone. He is absolutely electric after the catch. I know he's not the most, I think he could do a little bit better, but some of these plays he's making guys miss and finding ways to get to the end zone. He finds extra yardage after the catch, and I think that's something impressive about him. And keep in mind, he's only been playing this position for, I believe, 3 years. He switched from quarterback to tight end, so he's still younger at this position. So he has the ability to develop more as a tight end. I think that's another thing that's very enticing about him. Um, I think that his vertical provides a great opportunity for him to be a red zone threat in the league once he makes it in. He might not be the greatest, and I said this here when I'm talking about my routes and my cons. Very unpolished route tree. I think he could get better there. Not great at sinking his hips at the top of his routes at his breaks, things like that. But when you get to the red zone, that stuff matters a little bit less when you have a vertical like he does, the length like he does. He could turn into a fade ball magnet, a slot down the seam guy. Things like that become a lot more of an availability in the red zone, and I think that could be a great plus for him when teams are looking at his tape and things like that. Other cons, he's very, very limited as a blocker. He's going to be more of a slot or a F type tight end. He's not going to be in line very much in the NFL, and I think that's a major con. And some teams, like Ty and I just discussed, right? Some teams are going to be valuing the Y tight end over the F tight end. Some teams are going to be valuing the pass catching back or tight end more than the inline tight end. So it just depends on how teams value that, but he's very much limited as an inline tight end, and I don't see him doing that much in the league. So overall, very, very unfinished product here, but has the potential to be a huge playmaker in the league. When Ty, Sturb, and I are discussing it, we talk about Colston Loveland a lot because I had an infamous take on last year's tight end episode podcast where I said that Colston Loveland wasn't worth the first round pick. I think Eli Stowers is probably a second or third round. He's going to be a day 2 pick, I think, in my eyes. He might have worked his way into the first round with his combine. That would be a surprise, but I think he will be a day 2 pick. But I said that I think he could be a more explosive pass catching option than Loveland in the pass game. Watch his tape. I stepped back on that a little bit, but I do still think it's possible. And I think that he truly does have that potential to be just a freak in the passing game and could really excel as a tight end 1 in the pass game. But again, like I said, I don't see teams using him in line, so that kind of limits his production and his use on as a 3-down tight end goes. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on him, Ty?
Yeah, I think if a team takes him in the first round, it's a huge mistake because I do think, there is the upside with some of the things you mentioned, right? Like he does understand spacing. I think a lot of the things that translate so well from being a quarterback into a
Mm-hmm.
receiver, right? Like you just understand a lot of those things. But
Yeah.
he needs to size is a huge issue, right? He is a liability in the run game. Like he has to be off the field in any rundown situations, almost like an Evan Ingram and having to see Evan Ingram come off the field every single time we run the football kills me, right? So,
Mhm.
if you're going to take this guy uh, in the first round, I think it's huge overvalue, right? I think in the second or third round, yes, because there's the ability to grow. He's got to gain some weight, right? That can happen at the NFL level. We talked about that with guys like Spencer Fondu in the offensive line, room. But I think something that won't change, especially as he gains weight, is the twitchiness. He doesn't really have some of the twitch that, like a Michael Trigg has, right? Like
Yep.
the ability to make guys miss after the catch. I think, like you mentioned, he's got pretty good straight line speed. He ran the 4.51, but I think when it comes to the lateral quickness, um, that shows up in the route running. He doesn't create a ton of separation, right? He does a great job of catching balls outside of his frame, but the ball has to be placed outside of his frame because he's not creating any separation and there's a DB on his back. So at the next level, what does that look like where guys are bigger, stronger, faster, right? I
Yeah.
don't think that it translates as well. And as guys again are bigger and stronger, does the weight become an issue at the contact point, right? Because he does a good job of catching the football at the contact point now, but is that going to translate well into the NFL? I don't know. I don't really think so. I think that some of those things, the weight is just a huge problem for me. My biggest thing too, I watched a couple games, but when you turn on the Bama game, he didn't show up in the biggest moment of that game at the end of the game on a third down and a fourth down. Granted, it was a 4th and 20, but Diego Pavia put a ball in his hands on third and fourth down that he dropped. And I don't know if they were deemed drops, in the stat sheet, but they were balls that he should have caught. And he didn't show up in the biggest moment for his team. A game that Vandy was competing in, a game that, everyone thought they were going to win because they beat Bama the year before. Diego came back, right? They were the team that was favored to win that game and he didn't show up in a big moment. And it wasn't even a question of the contact, right? There was no contact on it. He just straight up dropped the ball that he was kind of, outside of his frame. And that was such a strength of his, right, in a lot of different areas. But when it came to a big moment against Bama, he didn't show up. So it's a concern for me. I think, he'd be an awesome third round pick with the upside. But I don't love the value at the end of the first round.
Yeah, and that's another thing with the combine, right? The whole discussion there is as soon as he jumps this 45-inch vert, it's crazy that the discussions that were being had around him on social media, things like that, and it immediately bumped him up, and people were talking about him as a first rounder. So it's crazy how something like as silly as that can bump you up the board that much, but it's possible. And we'll be watching the first round. We'll be doing our mock drafts, things like that, to see if maybe there's a fit in that the end of that first round. But yeah, like you said, Ty, I just don't really necessarily see it. I think round 2, round 3 is going to be the spot for him, but I do love the potential there. Moving on to our number 4 guy, we have Jack Endries from Texas here. Ty, what are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I think, you got to look at the Cal tape a ton with him because the drop off, some of these transfers, they just didn't have as much success in their second location. I thought he grew a lot at Texas because he was asked to block more, kind of be that more inline blocker with the way that Texas likes to run the football with, kind of the stable backs that they had and younger quarterback not having as much success. And I think Arch Manning was kind of a big reason why he had kind of a letdown of a season going from Fernando Mendoza at Cal, not at Indiana, albeit kind of a not viewed as a number one overall pick, Fernando
Mhm.
Mendoza, but still had that potential to Arch Manning, who everyone thought was going to be the first overall pick, and he struggled. So, I think he's a good route runner. I think he's got really soft hands. He's a good blocker inside and outside, right? Because they ask him to be out wide a little bit, which is, for a guy that's a little bit bigger at 6'4", 240, I think he did a really good job of blocking out there. He's not a mauler by any means, but I think, if you try to just watch the Texas tape, and I'm going to keep going back to this point, if you try to just watch the Texas tape, you're going to think that this guy's probably a 4th or 5th round pick, right? The
Yeah.
production's not really there. He shows up every now and then. If you watch the Cal tape, this was a guy that was thought of as probably a late day 1, early day 2 kind of guy. I don't think that he got any worse, right? Because I think a lot of the things still carry over, right? You watch the same, I think the route running, it doesn't look any different from Cal to Texas. There was no drop issues at Texas, right? I think it's just overall he stepped into a situation where there was more established receivers and a young struggling quarterback, and they kind of turned to the run game a little bit more because they had a stable of running backs, right? Where they had, I think they had 2 or 3 guys coming into the season that all could have been options for them. One of the guys ended up going down. So I think it was just a product of the situation with him. I think you get him in a right spot in the NFL. he's the prototypical size at, like I said, 6'4", 240. And the fact that this guy can play outside a little bit, right? I don't think, I think he's mostly a Y, but if you're able to spread a guy out like it this is not a comparison at all, right? I don't think he's this player, but it kind of reminded me a little bit of Travis Kelce, right? And maybe it's the number, but I think, they have a similar size and a similar play style ability where, it's that Travis does a really great job of finding soft spots and zones. I thought that he did a great job of that at Cal. It doesn't show up a ton at the Texas tape, but at Cal, he was constantly the go-to check down option for Mendoza because he was just finding the soft spot in the zone. And, we're going to probably talk about that with a decent amount of these guys, but that's why they're the top 5 tight ends in this class, right? Because they have the understanding of space, spatial awareness and finding those soft spots. So I think that this is a guy that will probably go in the 3rd round, and he could be your starting tight end at the end of camp because he has that kind of potential.
Yeah, he's a guy for me. I don't have too much to add about him. I think he's a solid tight end all around, like you said, good size, things like that. Ran a 4.6 240. That's not necessarily like, and when we're talking about tight ends, like I'm not too worried about that, right? Because they're not too worried about them running straight line speed down the field. That's not really what they're
Carnell
known
Tate
for.
ran a 4.6.
That is true. He was very. Now Adam Schefter was going on about it today that every single team had him hand timed as a 4.4 guy. It's hand time. Like I get that teams are having these hand times, but the laser, whatever, the technology had him at a 4.5, 4.6. So and I'm not even saying that's a bad thing. I think there's plenty of receivers that have shown again, time and again, that 4.5, 40 is kind of where you want to be if you're a receiver, because there's been a lot of success there. And if you're a tight end, 4.6 isn't anything bad either. But anyways, for my thoughts on him, I kind of put him as an all-around tight end that can do a little bit of everything. And for that reason, he's better than half the guys on this list because he's solid at everything. And I think that's kind of a big plus when you're looking at some of these other guys who are good in one side of the field, bad at another thing. And I think that really does matter. And to compare it to last year, when I'm looking at the level of prospects and kind of where I would value it, I'm not saying he is the same player or play style as Mason Taylor, but it has a similar feel to Mason Taylor, as where I think he's a little bit reliable in everything he does, and he can be a starting tight end pretty quickly into his career, similar to Mason Taylor, right? He wasn't extremely productive this year, but he was the Jets' tight end 1 by the end of camp, and I think that's something we could see similar to that Jack Endries can do this year as well. So I really like that you brought that up, that, he's not necessarily the biggest he's not going to be the biggest eye test guy, but he has the possibility to be a starter at the end of training camp.
Mason Taylor, too, product of the system, right? Why he probably didn't have as good of a season.
Yeah.
The quarterback play there, pretty bad.
Yeah, because he had a couple games where he popped a little bit, and then it would just be right down in the dumps the next week. But if Jack Endries ends up,
you had him at 5, right?
Jack Endries, I had him at 5. Yes, he was my
and I had him at
5.
4. So
yeah, and I had Mason Taylor at 5 last year. So it's like very similar. Like as I'm saying, like I'm not comparing necessarily play style, but value of these guys.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think he's a very solid pick if your team lands him. You should be happy if your team goes and gets him. Moving on to our number 3, my number 4 guy, I have Justin Joly out of North Carolina State, 6 foot 3.5, 241 pounds, senior, 22 years old, 10.5-inch hands. That's a big plus when it comes to pass catchers. When you want a guy to catch a ball, bigger hands is always going to be a plus, I promise. 49 receiving yards, 489 receiving yards on 49 receptions last year. And he was very balanced both in and at the slot inline and at the slot position. One of the biggest pros I can say about him is that he loves to attack the ball with his hands, no matter where he's out in the field. If it's contested catch, even if it's wide open catch, he's going to use his hands to catch the ball. And that's a big plus when I'm looking at a receiver. He's able to find openings on the field in zone, is able to find separation as both a slot tight end and in line. He's solid after the catch. He loves making guys miss, things like that. He's very, very capable as a ball carrier. He's a capable blocker, but I want to see him improve it a little bit more. I think he's very, very willing. There's some reps on tape where he's making, he's squaring guys up right in the middle of the shoulder pads, good hands, things like that. But then there's other plays where he's getting overpowered, things like that. So I want to see him improve that a little bit, but he's very, very capable as a blocker, and he's going to grow. He's only 22 years old, or grow as a blocker. He's only 22 years old. He rounds off his routes at times, and he could develop his route tree a little bit more. That's kind of my cons for him. And then one thing I see about him is that he goes upfield on routes at times when he's like a crosser, things like that. He's going upfield a little bit, and that would allow guys to undercut his routes. We saw it on his gauntlet. If you watch his gauntlet, as he's going down the line, he's sort of veering off the line, going back away from it. So if you think about it, the way you're pointing your hands to catch the ball, he's going backwards the other way. And that allows NFL corners and DBs and linebackers, they're smart enough to jump under that and they will pick the ball off. So I want to see him just polish that, clean that up a little bit. But this is a guy that I could easily see being an impact tight end 2 immediately to start his career and then start and eventually become a tight end 1. Ty, what are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, just to add, the gauntlet drill is probably the best drill that translates into football, right? Because, like you said, if you start to swerve off, that gives any defensive guy, linebacker, safety, corners, the opportunity to jump in front of those things. And when you, like we said, bigger, stronger, faster at the NFL level, those are pick sixes instead of incompletion. So, yeah, I think that's a con. Definitely, I think that he's not tight to his routes, but I think more so than anyone in this class, maybe Max Klare would be the next closest. He runs the entire route tree, right? He's tasked with running a lot of those outward breaking routes that you don't see as much from some of these other tight ends, right? A lot of it is the go balls or maybe a little bit of a skinny post or a quick slant, but not a ton of those outward breaking routes. And he ran a ton of outs and a ton of post corner. So, it's good to see that he at least had the whole tree. The hands are insane. He might have the best hands in the class. Like you mentioned, big hands, but I think between him and Trigg, the jump ball catches, because he's attacking them, there's guys draped on him, and some of the one-handed catches that he made because his quarterback sucked. CJ Bailey was not great. There were some terrible balls to him that he had to catch one-handed, but it was pretty much a magnet, and he caught a ton of different passes. So, I agreed with you on pretty much everything, and just the biggest thing for me, I love the effort that this guy had. The touchdown that he scored with the pulled hammy, kind of looking like he was Greg Jennings.
Great
that
reference.
that
Great reference.
that play was amazing. I mean, he's literally pulling his hammy and he runs for like another 30 yards and scores a touchdown. So, higher for a guy, I think that he steps in. He's probably one of the best receiving threats in this class right away. Some of these guys may be better athletes, but him as a receiver with the hands that he has, the ability to run the whole tree, if he can just refine the route running a little bit, like you said, he can come in and be a solid tight end too that, plays a lot on second and third down for you as, a receiving threat.
Yeah, and talking about tight ends with athleticism, Ty, if we're going away from going to a more athletic guy here, Max Klare out of Ohio State, a very, very athletic player, but we didn't get to see that at the combine. He didn't run or anything there, so we don't get to see what he would run 40-wise. But what are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I don't know that he honestly would have had the best 40 because I don't think that it kind of depends, right? I don't think his initial speed is top notch, right? But I think he accelerates really well, and that's where in space he is awesome in space because he has the ability to let that acceleration kind of ramp up and make guys miss and just run away from guys a lot. You saw it a ton at Purdue, you saw it a little bit at Ohio State. He's kind of another guy similar to Endries where he ended up in a situation where the quarterback play was worse. Julian Sayin was better than Arch, but they had far more established wide receivers, and he just wasn't able to make as big of an impact. But, really soft hands. He's a good route runner, understands spacing really well. Again, he was probably up there with like Joe Royer as one of the guys that, was so really, really good in space. I don't think contact in the passing game was an issue. He's not for 6'5", 240, right? He could gain a little bit more weight, I think. But physicality or just catching, passes with contact, I don't think that was an issue. In the run game, he's got the willingness to stick his nose in, but he's not a mauler. Again, I think he could use a little bit more weight. The biggest con for me, I think, was physicality in the route running. I think he can get knocked off of his stem every now and then because, again, like I said, like he's not the biggest guy for a 6'5", 6'5", 240. You think about Joe Royer, he had about another 10 pounds on him. 10 pounds goes a long way, especially depending on how you're built. So I think, and the concerning thing with Klare was it was DBs knocking him off his stem more often than not, right? It wasn't bigger linebackers. It was like safeties knocking him off his stem. So I think he's a great athlete. I think he's got all the, capability of being a great receiving tight end and also just kind of, being a good all around tight end. Because he's a good blocker, it doesn't have to be a mauler. He can stay on the field on all three downs because he has the ability to just wall guys off. But I think if he gains a little bit more weight, it'll help him in the run game and also just help him be a little bit more physical as a route runner.
Yeah, yeah. Just to say, I mean, I think the big thing with him is his size. Like you mentioned, we see it in the run game. He is a capable blocker, but you see him at time. His strength and his weight prohibits him from really being able to be an anchor and prevent guys from getting past him. And I think that's something that we see in his tape. I want to see him use his hands more in the pass game. I think at times he lets the ball into his body, down the seam, things like that. I want to see him go and attack the ball like a guy we just talked about, who is going out and just attacking the ball at the point of catch, and that will always be something that bumps up tight ends on my draft board. Some pros that I just wanted to mention real quick. I really loved his ability as a chip blocker to be patient and then run the route after. He makes a chip, he makes sure no one else is
Mhm.
coming, and then he runs a route and he goes upfield and he gets open and he finds space. That I think is a great trait. You see it a lot on his tape. And then another thing, and this could just be again how OSU is using him, right? He's getting more and more used to doing this. Is he was used in motion a ton at Ohio State, and I think that's a great thing to learn and excel at when you're going into the NFL, especially in the modern era. We're seeing it all the time. Motion is being used at the highest rate it's being used right now in the game. And I think that's a huge pro. He can be immediately plugged into a lot of schemes nowadays where teams are using more motion. He can run routes to that motion. He can block. He can do everything. They disguise it. Once he's able to do that in the NFL, I think he'll really be a great tight end for a team. And I think he already is starting to learn that at Ohio State.
I want to add this too about Claire. If you're a listener and you have concerns about, kind of the production at Ohio State, right? Think about this at Purdue. Think about how bad that team was. He was the sole option, and the
Yeah.
production that he was able to have, you know, eh, you don't really see that, right? Teams are going to be able to key in on a guy like that. So that just kind of, shows you what a special player this guy is, and it just probably was a product of a system for the reason for the drop off.
Yeah, yeah, and Ty and I were talking about this before we started recording is how valuable it is to tight ends to potentially not transfer. We saw him and Endries both transfer from their past schools to bigger schools in an attempt to get their name more out there. And in the end, it hurt their production, and I feel like it hurt their perspective as a fan. I'm going out and I'm looking, oh, I didn't really hear his name that much this season. Maybe he's not as good. He wasn't as productive this season. Maybe he wasn't as good. But when you turn on the tape and you look at past years, he was great. And at Purdue, he was productive. I'm watching that tape and I'm like, holy crap. It immediately jumped him up my board from watching the Ohio State tape. So when you look at tight ends, we saw it last year with Harold Fannin. We were like, oh, it's a smaller school. The production might not mean as much, things like that. The quality of opponents. But then he went into the NFL and immediately balled out. And so for guys like this, and at the tight end position in particular, where you have to battle receivers for catches, especially at Texas and Ohio State, it does seem to hurt these guys' outlook as a prospect. And so it's an interesting question in theory of should they stay at their schools or should they transfer to bigger schools?
I think both of them definitely gained, something from going to both these
Oh yeah,
prospective
definitely.
schools. So, you talked about Claire, kind of that inline motion a ton, right?
Mhm.
That's going to translate. Endries, I talked about him becoming more of that kind of Y blocker, right? I think they both gain things, but like you said, right, the fan doesn't see, kind of that production. And if you're at a smaller school, they think the same thing, oh, why is he producing? I think it's a little different with these two guys, though,
They were
than
at
a
bigger
guy like
schools, yeah.
Fannin, right? Because yeah, they were competing in, at the time it was the ACC, or excuse me, the Pac-12 with Endries at Cal, and then it was in the Big Ten. But you saw Fannin competing against a team like Penn State. So I think it's all about the competition that they're playing. I don't think we
Mhm.
should be looking at the school necessarily. It's just like, are there guys on the other team that are even NFL level players, right? And if
Yeah.
they're able to dominate against some of those guys, then you look at it a little bit differently.
Yeah. Moving on to our top spot and probably everyone's consensus number one tight end in this class. We got Kenyon Sadiq out of Oregon, a freak athlete, 6'3", 241 pounds at the combine, only 21 years old, 4.3. He ran a 4.3940, which is insane for a tight end in this era. And there were a few really, really fast tight ends this year. I think there was a guy that might have, didn't someone run faster than him, or was he the fastest? Or was it
No, he's
close?
the fastest ever.
There was a couple close to him in the
There
four
was
fours.
some
I thought.
low 4.5s and I think 4.4, maybe. I
I
don't
think there
know.
was like one other 4.4, but yeah,
Yeah.
it was a much faster tight end group this season, and we're seeing it more at every position. It's definitely because guys are straight up just training for the 40 because it's bumping them up draft boards. We see a lot of the 3 cone drill stop. People are stopped running it completely. So I think that's going to kind of continue to be fading out, but people are running the 40 time, training for it more. So we're going to see these 40 times continue to go up, but 10-inch hands to go on top of that, 43.5-inch vertical, absolutely absurd. 26 reps on the bench press. That's an absurd thing to do as well, in addition to running fast and having a vertical that he did. 51 receiving receptions, 560 receiving yards, and 8 touchdowns. But like we mentioned with some of these other guys, he was way more of a slot than an inline tight end. And I think that's something that knocks him down a little bit on people's boards. But at the same time, his production from the slot and his ability from the slot are going to make him, as soon as you watch his tape, you're going to forget that he wasn't mainly inline tight end. Some pros for him: he's freakishly athletic, undersized in height, but filled out in frame. You look at the guy, he looks like a freaking juggernaut because he's so built. Very active as a blocker. I think his effort is there. When you see him in the run game and in the pass or run game, or when he's blocking on screens and things like that, he's very, very active. Could he improve? Yes, but he has the effort and it's there, and he has the strength to make up for it. So I think he can improve that. He's still young. He's going to improve in the NFL. Solid route runner, and he attacks the ball with his hands a good amount. Great up the seams. We've seen it a lot at Oregon and in his tape. He's a down the seam threat on multiple occasions. He can run a full route tree. He's being used on all sides of the field. Cons, probably shorter than teams would like him to be, but he makes up for it with his effort and athleticism. And you see him hurdling guys, things like that after the catch. And still, he's going to be able to jump with that vertical and go and catch balls that, other corners on him, things like that. He's going to can still be able to go up and get those balls. He can tidy up his routes at the break point a little bit. I see him drift or round them off at times, and that's something that, you just clean up a little bit. Then he doesn't have the greatest production for a player that's in his range. We've seen him now mocked all the way up to the top 10. I've seen him mocked to the Saints at number 8 by a couple Saints fans, and that it just seems a little bit high for me. For him, for Kenyon Sadiq, in my personal opinion, I'd see him maybe anywhere after 15, maybe top 10 to 15 range, but anywhere after 15, I think, is where that's more of an appropriate pick for him. He's not a Brock Bowers type. He's not a Tyler Warren type. Maybe I would say he's a better prospect than Colston Loveland athletically, and I think that kind of gives him that notch above Loveland in my eyes. But I just think he's not a top 15 prospect. What are your thoughts, Ty?
Yeah, I don't know. I think scheme screws him, honestly. I think,
Sure.
the way that they tried to run their offense there at Oregon and how it's been for years is they spread everything out, right? It's to all different types of receivers, to all different tight ends. Like, he's competing within his own position group with Jamari Johnson, who's a guy who's probably going to be viewed as a first or second round pick next season. The year before that, he was competing with Terrence Ferguson for reps. So, there's constantly this, Oregon uses a ton of receivers, and it's great because they send a lot of guys to the NFL. But then these guys have a transition period where it takes them maybe a year or two to get ready, right? You see it with Troy Franklin. You see it with, Tez Johnson. You see it with Terrence Ferguson, right? Some of these guys were able to contribute, but the contribution wasn't, what you thought it would be from a guy coming from such a good school that, throws the ball all around the yard. Now, do I think that he's a better athlete than all those guys? Yes. And I think that, fluidity and the just pure athleticism and size will help him contribute right away. But I think there will be a bit of a, period where he's going to have to work on. You mentioned the route tree, and he has the ability to run the whole tree. He wasn't tasked with running the whole tree a ton. A lot of it was screens. They used him on like jet sweeps, end arounds. They ran a swinging gate with him on a 2-point conversion against UCLA. Like, he's versatile, right? They used him in a ton of different ways, but they weren't asking him to run routes in the same way that we look at some of these other tight ends. Almost the first 5, if you turn on like his highlight reel, the first like 5 to 7 plays are like rocket screens. That's insane for a tight end. And it's like he's out wide and he's got 2 receivers blocking for him. We're throwing the ball to a tight end on a rocket screen with 2 guys that are 180 pounds blocking for him. I just don't understand the Oregon scheme. I get it. It showcases a lot of his rack ability, his speed, his ability. He's got really soft hands, but I just think that the scheme ultimately screws him in the eyes of NFL guys because you don't see him blocking as much as a Tyler Warren or a Brock Bowers, but he's a serviceable blocker because he's super athletic. He's a big guy. I think that shows up. He has got a lot of effort when he blocks. It's just the effort, the technique is not refined. But was the technique really as refined with Tyler Warren, a guy that they used in a lot of different
Mhm.
areas. I think he's a good blocker, but I think, there's just the scheme doesn't let Kenyon Sadiq showcase his entire skill set as such an athletic guy, a guy that is a good route runner. He does a good job of, breaking down and changing speeds to sell different routes. But you have to look at it on like skinny posts and verts, right? Like it
Mhm.
doesn't show up in a post corner or, in some of these other ways. One of the only post corners you can see on him and his highlight reel was a slot fade, that he ran against Minnesota that he caught a
Yeah.
touchdown on, and he burnt the guy and he caught a great ball. But it's just Oregon kind of screws him with the way that they run their offense and with the way that they get him the football.
Yeah, he's a guy too that I just think when you go into his tape, like you said with the screens, it's just so funny because you're like, why is this tight end getting so many screens? And like you said, it shows off his rack ability. He'll go and get the ball and then go hurdle two guys back to
The
back. Like
hurdling is
it's the
absurd.
hurdling. He spams the Y button. It's his
Yeah.
favorite button to hit on the controller for sure. But I think he definitely has the ability to be a great replacement for some tight end out there. And let me say this: if the Chiefs, for some reason, after just getting a haul, if they go and they trade 9, and if Jeremiah Love gets taken, and they go, we don't love the picks here, and they trade back to 15, 16, get an extra second round or an extra first or something like that, you go and get Kenyon Sadiq and get Travis Kelce to be replaced in the future with Kenyon Sadiq. I think that immediately would be an absurd replacement for Travis Kelce. Absurd. It would be a
Yeah.
match made in heaven
The
for both.
problem is, and I said this to you earlier today, I hope that the Kansas City Chiefs take
Yeah.
Jeremiah Love because who the hell is blocking for them? Who the hell's blocking for Patrick Mahomes so he can get Kenyon Sadiq the ball? Are they going to run rocket screen? Is this going to become the Oregon
Hey,
offense?
if
Maybe.
Kenyon Sadiq is there, it might. It
Maybe because
might.
that's what they had to do with Rashi Rice in order to get him the ball
Yeah.
because they can't block for long enough. So, listen, we'll talk about the Chiefs later on and kind of what their needs are in the free agency video. But I pray to God that they take a weapon and not an offensive lineman.
Yeah, we'll definitely. I mean, they'll definitely need someone because Rashi Rice off the field issues are starting to get crazier and he's just not managing his PR right now at a high
He's on my
level
dynasty
at all.
team too.
Ty opens up
Not a
his
good
Twitter
look.
feed every day, so just to see
Just waiting to see if
another.
Shefty tweets out he's arrested and suspended for the year.
Yeah, because now he had domestic abuse allegations against him now, is in addition to the speeding, the crash, and running away from it.
I should say this: what if it's true? It's wrong, right? I got to get ahead of that. I just hope it's not true for the woman and
Yeah,
for my dynasty team.
and for the dynasty, yeah, the priorities you got to value both. I get it for
Yeah.
sure. Anyways, moving on from our tight end prospects, real quick, I went to trivia before we started recording this. That's one of my things to do in my area. Enjoy doing it. They had an NFL question, Ty, where it was the theme was over under. The number is 90. So you had 3 questions you have to answer if they're over, under, and 90. So the first question: the Broncos broke the NFL touchdown record, scoring this many touchdowns as a team in 2015.
Let's think. Peyton had 50 plus. I think he had 50, 55. No chance that No Sean Marino and the
Exactly.
gang got
Exactly.
50 more touchdowns. So I'm going to go the under.
Yeah, when I was sitting there, I was like, record, maybe they got to 90. And then I started thinking about it. I was like, yeah, no running back is getting
I mean, No
an
Sean would have had to have
additional.
like 30 touchdowns.
There's no additional 40 rushing touchdowns in there. Maybe 10 to 15, maybe to 20 even is like reasonable. But yeah, once you're getting in that 30, 40 range, it's just not happening. So
Yeah.
under is the correct answer there. Number 2 is John Randall's number, the Hall of Famer.
He was over.
Yeah, 93 was his. And
Yeah.
then the third question is the longest punt in NFL history, over or under 90 yards.
Because they don't count it if it's a touchback, do they?
Nope.
Damn, this is a tough one. Did you get this one?
I did. It was purely rationale though.
Over under 90 yards. I'm gonna say under. That seems
It's over with 98
Wow.
yards. 98 yards.
Wow.
And my
Who the
only
hell kicked that?
it was the Jets punter from let me find it.
It wasn't Leckler? Holy shit, dude. 98 yards.
Steve O'Neal, 98 yards.
Wow. I was
Yeah.
tempted to say over because I was like, oh,
The
why the hell would they
my
ask
the
this question?
only
But
the only reason I said over, I was like, probably a red zone punt that just rolled a shit ton. I was like, it's
dude, it
possible.
must
It
have
was
been a
pure
windy
guess.
day.
Yeah, but it was over, and I guarantee it was
Wow.
after a bunch of bounces. I haven't watched it or gone and searched it, but fun little trivia questions there. After that, there were a bunch of other questions I did not know. So thankfully, I got the NFL questions right. At least running an NFL podcast, hopefully you would guess that I get these right. And
Know
I
your role. Know your role.
was 3 for 3. Yeah, yeah. On the trivia team, that's my spot is old 80s rock music and football. So and sport other sports as well. But Ty, what if you had a trivia category that you would excel the most at that isn't sports, what would it be?
I am a trivia guy. I do go every now and then. Just went last week. I'm usually pretty good at the pop culture stuff, honestly. I'm not I'm in
Interesting.
touch. I'm in touch with a lot of things. I'm on the TikTok and all that stuff. Check it out. Orange crushing it. But yeah, I'm up to date.
I keep in touch with the Gen Z knowledge and everything and the millennial knowledge.
Yeah.
I get it. Yeah, no, yeah, definitely. Pop culture is not necessarily my thing, but I'll get some questions. Movies too. Movies are another one of
Yeah, yeah.
mine that I
Gotta
can.
be an all around threat.
Yeah, yeah. It's important to broaden your horizons and there's one team every time we've gone. There's one team that comes in first with a perfect score, and there's just no way they're
Gotta
not
be
cheating.
cheating.
Gotta be. I'm like that.
No.
There's no shot. I will say they have like 10 people, so the number of
Okay, you gotta split the
the number of
teams.
brains, but yeah, that's what I'm
Yeah,
saying
come
is
on.
we got to get someone to go
Come
in
on.
there, break up the
6
team, break up
people
the party.
max.
Yeah.
6 people. I'm the Jack Endries of trivia. I could do it all, but not great.
Yeah, it's nuts. When I go, it's like me and a couple other buddies, my girlfriend, we're all 22, 23 years old. The knowledge is compared to the rest of the older people at the bar is not there, and we're only 4 people, and so we
If you're
usually
using
finish.
ChatGPT though, these people are cheating. You can't be giving a
I
perfect score and not using
exactly.
AI.
Exactly. There's some AI or something being used out there listening in and giving answers. But anyways, comment down below what your best trivia category would be. I'd love to hear that down below if you've made it this far. After all, this is our tight end group. It's not the biggest position of worry in the NFL. We're going to be breaking down more premium positions later on. I don't remember what next week is. I don't want to say it's linebackers, but I will confirm that and we will figure that out. But I want to say linebackers is next week. We'll look forward to that. You guys know where to find us on social media at Jinxon and wherever you get your podcasts at Jinxon as well. And keep your eyes out for a free agency episode we're going to be releasing this Saturday. Keep your eyes out for that. That's going to be a huge one before Monday free agency starts. Anyways, we'll see you guys next time on Saturday.